Thank you for that introduction, Ray. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Nolen, and I am a compliance reviewer in FDA's Office of Scientific Investigations, Compliance Enforcement Branch. Today, I am pleased to discuss a general overview of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Bioresearch Monitoring Program. Please note that the contents of this presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views and/or policies of the Food and Drug Administration or its staff. During this presentation, I will begin with an overview of CDER's BIMO program, followed by a description of good clinical practice inspections under the BIMO program. Then I will discuss CDER BIMO inspections and related activities, and summarize recent trends in BIMO compliance and enforcement activities. The FDA is composed of several centers and offices based on different regulatory and research activities. The FDA regulates food products, drug products, biological products, medical devices, radiological products, cosmetics, veterinary products, and tobacco products. The Bioresearch Monitoring, or BIMO program, is housed in the Office of Regulatory Affairs and is shared by all FDA centers. The center of focus for today's webinar is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, which ensures that safe and effective drug products are available to improve public health. CDER regulates prescription and over-the-counter drugs, including generic drugs and biological therapeutics. CDER is also made up of various offices to manage the regulation of drug products. The Office of Compliance mission is to shield patients from poor quality, unsafe, and ineffective drugs through proactive strategies and risk-based enforcement actions guided by the law and science. The Office of Compliance's Office of Scientific Investigations administers the BIMO compliance programs for CDER. The Office of Regulatory Affairs, or ORA, inspects regulated products and manufacturers, conducts sample analysis of regulated products, and reviews imported products offered for entry into the United States. ORA's Office of Medical Products and Tobacco Operations is responsible for the coordination, interpretation, and evaluation of the FDA's overall field inspections and compliance efforts for medical products and tobacco, which leads to the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations, which is responsible for the overall execution of ORA's BIMO program. The BIMO program is a comprehensive FDA-wide program of on-site inspections and data audits designed to monitor all aspects of the conduct and reporting of FDA-regulated research. BIMO program objectives are to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of human research subjects, verify the accuracy, reliability, and integrity of clinical and non-clinical trial data submitted to FDA, and assess compliance with FDA's regulations governing the conduct of clinical and non-clinical trials, including regulations for informed consent and ethical review. Each entity included in this schematic is responsible for protecting human subjects and ensuring the clinical trial data are accurate and reliable. BIMO inspections are conducted to assess compliance with FDA regulations governing the conduct of clinical and non-clinical trials. The oversight is intended to ensure trials are being conducted in a way that ensures data reliability, in particular for regulatory decision-making, and that ensure the rights and subjects in FDA-regulated research are being protected. This slide shows the governing framework under which we do our work. At the top of the pyramid are the laws and regulations we are responsible for ensuring compliance with. Observations of noncompliance with these laws or regulations are considered regulatory violations. Laws and regulations are enforceable and can lead to regulatory actions such as warning letters. Laws and regulations, however, are drafted broadly to meet the demands of different development programs, whereas guidances allow us to provide targeted recommendations in specific areas and can be much more specific about our current thinking. So overall, when we think about clinical trial conduct and whether data from those studies can be relied upon to determine if a drug is effective, we need to think beyond just regulatory compliance. We should also take into consideration the recommendations in FDA guidance documents. While not enforceable, these generally provide more specificity. In other words, while we won't cite a clinical investigator for noncompliance with language in a guidance, Guidances are important and represent our current thinking and are closer to best practices. The ICH E6R2 is a fundamental guidance that provides our current thinking and recommendations on good clinical practice, or GCP. GCP is the standard for certain aspects of the conduct of clinical trials that provides assurance that the data and reported results are credible and accurate, and that the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of trial subjects are protected. So you can see when we refer to BIMO program objectives as ensuring the reliability of data and that the rights of subjects are protected, this is really getting at ensuring that studies are conducted according to the principles of good clinical practice. While this list is not comprehensive, the regulations listed here are relevant to GCP. These regulations are cited in communications from the FDA when specific regulatory deficiencies are observed during an inspection. Thus, if we issue a regulatory action, it will be related to noncompliance with one of these regulations. Inspections of clinical investigators, sponsors, sponsor investigators, contract research organizations, and institutional review boards are all considered GCP-focused inspections. In addition to these GCP inspections, the BIMO program also includes inspections for post-marketing adverse event reporting, risk evaluation and mitigation strategies reporting, non-clinical lab inspections, and bioavailability, bioequivalence studies. This FDA.gov link provides the Compliance Program Manuals, or CPs, for each of the aforementioned inspection types. The CPs provide instructions to FDA personnel for conducting activities to evaluate compliance with FDA laws and regulations for each specific inspection type. CPs were developed to provide uniform guidance and instructions for the conduct of inspections, so if you are interested in understanding specifically what will be assessed during a clinical investigator inspection, for example, the CP for clinical investigators is publicly available and provides this information. Here, I'm highlighting the clinical investigators and sponsor investigators CP and the sponsors and CRO CP, which are recently updated. The clinical investigator CP was updated in July 2020, and the CRO CP was updated in September 2020. BIMO inspections ensure prospective, real-time, and retrospective oversight of clinical trial conduct. There are multiple offices involved in clinical trial conduct, including CDER's Office of New Drugs, Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, Office of Clinical Pharmacology, and Office of Biostatistics. For example, these offices may be involved in 30-day investigational new drug application safety reviews, protocol reviews, safety reports, and marketing application reviews. CDER's Office of Compliance, Office of Scientific Investigations, participates in GCP inspection site selections, complaint reviews, and institutional review board oversight. As previously mentioned, FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs is responsible for the coordination of field inspections. The following are the potential compliance classifications for an inspected entity. No action indicated, or NAI, when no regulatory violations are identified. Voluntary action indicated, or VAI, when regulatory violations are identified, but the violations have little to no impact on subject safety and/or data integrity. Therefore, the violations of the VAI do not meet the threshold to recommend regulatory action. Official action indicated, or OAI, when serious objectionable conditions are identified and/or when there is repeated or deliberate failure to comply with FDA regulations. Regulatory action is recommended for an OAI classification. Note that while the BIMO investigator recommends the initial classification, the center determines the final classification based on assessment of the establishment inspection report, evidence, the Form FDA 43 and 43 response, if applicable. My colleague, Dr. Faranak Jamali, will discuss the inspection process and these inspection classifications in more detail. In order to support regulatory decision-making and continue some form of oversight during the protracted travel restrictions related to COVID-19, FDA has been developing remote approaches to assessing establishments, including clinical trial sites and sponsors. In April 2021, we issued a guidance that provides an overview of what are called Remote Interactive Evaluations, or RIEs. RIEs are voluntary and may include the remote review of documents and other records. RIEs may be used to support regulatory decisions and oversight of establishments while limiting unnecessary contact. FDA applies risk management methods and tools to determine when to request a facility's participation in an RIE. The Resiliency Roadmap for FDA Inspectional Oversight Report detailed the state of FDA's inspectional activities as of March 2021 and how we would address postponed inspectional activities using a risk-based approach. We do not currently classify RIEs as we do inspections. Therefore, there are no NAI, VAI, or OAI classifications for RIEs. However, findings from an RIE could lead to regulatory meeting or sending an advisory letter, such as a warning or entitled letter. Now I'd like to discuss some metrics from CDER BIMO inspection activities. Note that the fiscal years are reported as governmental fiscal years, which begin in October and end the following September. Thus, fiscal year 2020 refers to October 2019 through September 2020. Data from previous years are included for the sake of shared information, and I will not speculate on trends in inspections or classifications. You can see that the majority of inspections conducted each year are for clinical investigators, or CIs, as well as bioavailability and bioequivalence. The inspection activities are pretty consistent across the years, except noticeably in fiscal year 2020. In response to the presidential declaration of national emergency related to the COVID-19 pandemic, travel restrictions began on March 13, 2020. Generally speaking, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, routine surveillance inspections were postponed beginning March 13, 2020. Mission-critical inspections were conducted on a case-by-case basis. When we look specifically at the CI inspections, the majority of CI inspections in fiscal year 2020 were conducted as data audits. Most data audit inspections are for clinical trials completed and submitted in support of a marketing application, such as a new drug application, abbreviated new drug application, or biologic licensing application. Data audit inspections are requested by CDER's review divisions in the Office of New Drugs, Office of Clinical Pharmacology, and Office of Generic Drugs. For-cause inspections are triggered from a referral or a complaint from a variety of sources, which may include clinical study staff, study participants, monitors, sponsors, and CROs. While we're focusing on CI inspections, the majority of CI inspections in fiscal year 2020 were domestic, while a smaller percentage of inspections were conducted for foreign entities, in part due to the COVID-19 travel restrictions. Here, while we see a general uptick in CI inspections from 2017 to 2019, there was a decrease in CI inspections in 2020, again due to the COVID-19 travel restrictions. In fiscal year 2020, most of the inspections were classified as NAI, where no regulatory violations were identified. 86 inspections were classified as VAI, where regulatory violations may have been identified but were not at the threshold to take or recommend administrative or regulatory action. Finally, there were 4 inspections classified as OAI. Thus, serious objectionable conditions were identified and regulatory actions were recommended for 4 of the fiscal year 2020 inspections conducted. These graphs illustrate sponsor, sponsor investigator, and contract research organization inspections. Of these inspected entities, the majority of inspections were conducted for sponsors. Here, you'll see that the majority of inspections were classified as NAI in fiscal year 2020, with no OAIs in fiscal year 2020. Today, my goal was to provide you with a general overview of the CDER BIMO program. In summary, FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program monitors all aspects of clinical trial conduct and reporting of CDER-regulated research to ensure clinical trials are being conducted in a way that ensures data integrity and the rights of participants in clinical trials are being protected. GCP inspections are a crucial component of the BIMO program. BIMO GCP inspections also ensure that clinical trials are conducted according to applicable regulations. multiple offices throughout the FDA are involved in clinical trial oversight, and GCP inspection activities include, but are not limited to, inspections for clinical investigators, sponsors, sponsor investigators, contract research organizations, and institutional review board. I've included this list of resources which are relevant to the content of this presentation. At this time, let's try a challenge question to gauge your understanding of the CDER BIMO program. Which of the following is not one of the BIMO program objectives? Protect the rights, safety, and welfare of human research subjects. Protect the public health by enforcing compliance with FDA's guidances governing the conduct of clinical and non-clinical trials. Verify the accuracy, reliability, and integrity of clinical and non-clinical trial data submitted to FDA. Or assess compliance with FDA's regulations governing the conduct of clinical and non-clinical trials. Answer B is not an objective of the BIMO program. While FDA guidances do provide recommendations based on FDA's current thinking on specific topics, guidances are not enforceable as compared to laws and regulations which are enforceable. Thank you very much for your attention. At this time, I will turn over the webinar to my colleague, Dr. Faranak Jamali, who will discuss the GCP inspection process and possible outcomes.
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Faranak Jamali, and I'm also a compliance reviewer in the same branch, division, and office as Dr. Kelly Nolen. I'm here to talk about CDER GCP inspections and outcomes. The contents of this presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views and/or policies of the Food and Drug Administration. In today's talk, I will go over the steps of the GCP inspection process, and then we'll have a slide on the possible outcomes of these inspections. I will also have a few slides explaining serious non-compliance, and we'll bring a few case examples to help you understand better the different inspectional findings. And at the end, I will conclude my presentation with a few tips on corrective and preventive actions. Who do we consider for GCP inspections? These were previously discussed by my colleague Dr. Nolen, but I just wanted to reiterate here that clinical investigators, the sponsors, sponsor investigators, and IRBs are entities that are inspected under GCP BIMO program, and the focus of my talk today will be on the first three bullets. As per our regulations, a clinical investigator is the individual who conducts the clinical investigation and is responsible for overall conduct of the study at the clinical site. A sponsor is an entity who takes responsibility for and initiates the clinical investigation under 21 CFR 312.3. The sponsor may transfer any or all of its responsibilities to a contract research organization or CRO. This is required to be done in writing. And a sponsor investigator is an individual who initiates and also conducts the clinical investigation. Therefore, a sponsor investigator must comply with regulatory requirements that apply to both sponsors and clinical investigators. And at the end, institutional review boards are any board, committee, or other groups formally designated by an institution to review or to approve the initiation of or to conduct periodic review of biomedical research involving human subjects. Now I would like to get into some details of our inspection processes and walk you through each step of the CDER GCP inspection of those entities just mentioned. All right. This slide is a schematic of the roadmap of a GCP inspection, starting with the site selection, to conducting the inspection, to issuance of the final letter or correspondence to the inspected entity, and if needed, a follow-up investigation or inspection. First, let's talk about a little bit site selection factors for CI inspections. Inspections are processed on a case-by-case basis. To determine which sites to inspect, FDA uses a site selection tool which uses a risk-based approach, and this tool is used because sometimes the clinical trials are multi-centers. For example, they have multiple national and international sites, and it gets really complicated if we were to inspect all of them. With the site selection tool, we can pick the sites that have higher risk based on a variety of factors such as enrollment, efficacy outcome, complaints, serious adverse events, deaths, protocol deviations, discontinuation rate, time since last inspection, and number of INDs. This tool allows us to use a consistent science-based approach. Typically, as part of an NDA or BLA review, we will inspect between 2 to 5 clinical investigator sites, and we may also inspect the sponsor and or CRO during the review cycle. Of course, the considerations would be different if we are talking about site selection for NDA or BLA review as compared to site selection processes for review of complaints and referrals. GCP inspection processes. Now, I would like to give you an overview of the GCP inspection processes. Let's see what triggers a GCP inspection. There are 3 pathways that could lead to an inspection. First, the pre-approval data validation for an NDA or new drug application. This path usually starts with a CDER, Office of New Drugs Review Division, or for a pre-approval data audit, or it could be for for-cause inspections, could initiate with reports from a sponsor or IRB report, or a complaint that could originate from any source. And the third type are the routine surveillance inspections of the IRBs or radioactive drug research committees or other inspected entities. OSI issues inspection assignments to the Office of Regulatory Affairs or ORA. These offices conduct domestic or international inspections. ORA field investigators, they review the study records with or any relevant regulatory documentation. At the end of each inspection, the inspectional findings will be reviewed and discussed with the inspected entity, and if necessary, a Form FDA 483 will be issued to the inspected entity, which will include the inspectional findings. In addition, an Establishment Inspection Report or EIR will be prepared and sent to the OSI or us together with the evidence collected to support the findings. We will review all the material collected during the inspection together with the inspected entity's response to the Form 483, and if any was sent to us. And then the final classification of each inspection is based on the significance and the impact of the findings, and a correspondence will be issued to the inspected entity. As one of the objectives of the inspection is the data integrity audit, which includes audit of hard copy or electronic data to verify that the data submitted to the FDA was accurate and that CDER reviewers can rely on the submitted data. So OSI makes recommendations regarding data reliability to CDER review divisions. So these are the records that are reviewed during a GCP inspection. ORA investigators will determine whether IRB review and approval of the investigational plan was obtained whether consent process was adequately performed, the site adhered to the protocol and investigational plan, did the subjects exist in the study, did the site enroll the subjects based on eligibility criteria, and also the field investigators will verify primary efficacy and safety data. If the study design was requiring blinding, did the site adequately blind the study drug or procedures that were required by the protocol, and were reporting procedures done adequately, for example, serious adverse events or other adverse events, and safety data, including labs, EKGs, and other procedures that were required by the protocol, and also records related to drug accountability. If the site used electronic records and signatures, those are reviewed based on 21 CFR Part 11. Part 11 applies to a record required by a predicated rule that is created, modified, maintained, archived, retrieved, or transmitted in electronic form in place of a paper record, and when electronic signatures are used in place of traditional handwritten signatures. Here are the three key elements that are really important to review during the GCP inspections. Whether the subjects who participated in the study, their rights, safety, and welfare was not compromised. Whether the site, as I said, followed the investigational plan and the protocol. The protocol is the blueprint for communicating the study procedures and requirements to all parties involved in clinical trials. So, and then the third one would be verifying the data, whether the data were clearly reflecting the conduct of the study. And as the ALCOA principle indicates, whether they were attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate, plus complete, consistent, enduring, and available. And the FDA inspection, in the CI inspections, we compare source documents in the medical record data with case report forms and with data listings submitted to the NDA. Okay, now let's see what the potential outcomes could be and how we can classify the inspections. The final classifications of the GCP inspection was already discussed by Dr. Nolen, but I would like to also reiterate that the importance of OAI classification based on serious non-compliance when there is repeated and deliberate findings that indicate that the scope, severity, and pattern of the violations support the finding that subjects under the care of the clinical investigator would be or have been exposed to an unreasonable and significant risk of illness or injury, or subjects' rights, welfare, or safety would be or have been seriously compromised, and or data integrity or reliability is or has been compromised. Okay, when your site receives the Form 483 at the end of inspection, it is in your best interest if you submit a well-reasoned, complete, and timely response within 15 business days after the completion of the inspection. However, it is not a regulatory requirement to respond to Form 483. Your response may mitigate the FDA compliance decision. It may make a difference in the final classification or type of regulatory correspondence that you receive. If you submit a complete and timely response, it demonstrates your acknowledgement and understanding of the FDA observations, and it also demonstrates your commitment to correct the findings, and then it also establishes credibility with the FDA. In your response, we would like to see a statement about whether the 483 observation was accurate. If you have documents to disprove it, submit those documents. Is it a regulatory requirement? If you believe it was, please explain and bring appropriate documents to support it. If it is true and a regulatory document, explain why it didn't impact data reliability or subject safety. Okay, when you plan to respond to 483 observations, as I indicated in my previous slide, it's great to consider all of these bullets in your response, to provide it within the 15 business days, to address each observation separately, if you agree or disagree, and then provide corrective action and preventive actions, provide documentation, commitment, and a method, explain how you're going to do it, and submit all the supportive documentation such as SOPs, training, and other records that supports your response. Now, let's talk about what's considered serious noncompliance. This is how we classify letters as OAIs, as I also mentioned before. An OAI is recommended when the inspectional findings represent significant and serious and/or numerous regulatory violations, or when there is repeated or deliberate failure to comply with FDA regulations, or submission of false or fabricated data to the sponsor or to the FDA. For example, we issue a warning letter when we determine that the violations were significant and their scope, severity, or pattern seriously compromised data interpretability and/or subject rights or safety. So here's a slide about warning letters. Warning letter may be considered when the violations can be corrected through specific actions by the clinical site. For example, preparation and compliance with the detailed corrective action plan that is acceptable to the FDA, and there is a high probability that the site will adhere to corrective action plans to prevent similar or other violations from occurring in the future. A warning letter is informal and advisory. It communicates the agency's position on the matter, but it does not commit FDA to take enforcement actions. A follow-up inspection is followed to verify the site's corrective actions and ensuring compliance, and if all corrective actions appear to have been effectively implemented, an NAI may be issued to the inspected entity. A notice of initiation of disqualification proceedings and opportunity to explain, or NITPO, is the first step in the disqualification process. NITPOs may be considered when the inspectional findings meet the criteria for OAI, indicating that a clinical investigator or a sponsor investigator has repeatedly or deliberately failed to comply with the FDA requirements, or has repeatedly or deliberately submitted false information to the FDA or to the sponsor. CDER will furnish the investigator written notice of the matter complained of and offer the investigator an opportunity to explain the matter in writing, or at the option of the investigator in an informal conference. If an explanation is offered and accepted by the applicable center, the center will discontinue the disqualification proceeding. If an explanation is offered but not accepted by the center, the investigator will be given an opportunity for a regulatory hearing to see whether the investigator is eligible to receive any test article under Part 16 and eligible to conduct any clinical investigation that supports an application for a research or marketing permit for products regulated by FDA. Depending on the clinical investigator's response or reaction, a NITPO may either turn into a restricted consent agreement, or a notice of opportunity for hearing, or a disqualification, or if the response is adequate, no disqualification will occur. A NITPO is an administrative action. However, if a disqualification happens, then the disqualification is an enforcement action and represents the most serious type of action that we can take related to clinical investigators' noncompliance. This is a slide about follow-up inspections, but I know that my colleague, Dr. Rachelle Swann, will go into the details about follow-up inspection. So I will just briefly touch on the goals of follow-up inspection. It is done to ensure violations are not repeated in the ongoing studies or studies that are initiated after the OAI letter was issued, to verify implementation of corrective and preventive actions and to ensure compliance was sustained. Okay, next few slides are about metrics. This is a pie chart showing that among CDER BIMO inspections in fiscal year 2020, the clinical investigator inspections had the highest percentage of inspections compared to sponsors and other BIMO inspections. The next one is about warning letters issued between fiscal year 2011 and 2020. This bar graph is comparing the number of warning letters. And generally speaking, then regardless of COVID or other limitations, there is a variation in the number of warning letters issued each year. That variation is driven by a great number of factors spanning from the number and types of applications submitted, the number and type of allegations of research misconduct that we receive, the relative risk profile of various sites, sponsors, and CROs involved in generating the data submitted to the FDA. What you don't see here, but would see if you looked at our warning letters on the FDA website, is that in fiscal year 2021, we had a pretty dramatic uptick in the number of warning letters issued, but those metrics will come out in next year or this year, and you will see them as part of CDER BIMO presentation in the future. And this slide is showing the findings related to fiscal year 2020 deficiencies identified in clinical investigator inspections and comparing between those identified in domestic versus international sites. In both groups, protocol violations had the highest percentage of citations in the letters issued to inspected entities. However, this slide is specifically focusing on inspectional findings of the OAI letters to clinical investigators. So you can see the breakdown of the inspectional findings, which again shows that the protocol violations were the most common findings. And now this graph is showing the inspectional findings in sponsor inspections or CRO inspections. The protocol issues or failure to ensure the study is conducted according to the protocol and investigational plan under 21 CFR 31250 was the highest percentage of inspectional findings among sponsor inspections in fiscal year 2020. So hopefully you got an idea about the GCP BIMO inspection processes and the types of post-inspectional correspondence. Next, I would like to bring a few case examples of specific cases for a better understanding of what I described. In this example, the site enrolled and randomized 22 subjects into the study. All of them completed the study, and after the sponsor closed the study, the site packed all the study records into boxes and placed them into the archival room. When the sponsor CRO arrived at the site to prepare for FDA inspection, site noted that some study records were missing and site was unable to locate them. FDA conducted the inspection and confirmed that the CI did not retain study records. And these included informed consent forms, case report forms for all 22 randomized subjects, and medical histories, eligibility records, adverse events, concomitant medications, progress notes, and visit assessments for 16 of 22 randomized subjects. This CI was required to retain all study records for this protocol because an application had been filed for the indication under study and the outcome of the application had not yet been determined before the CI lost the study records. Because of the lost records, we were unable to verify the endpoint data in support of the application review. During the inspection, CI explained that his department went under reorganization, which made the conduct of clinical investigations difficult, and that was why some of the records were missing, even though his staff were the only ones who had access to the archival room. So an OAI classification was determined and a warning letter was issued because we had no indication of human subject protection and could not verify data integrity. So the FDA regulations under 21 CFR 312.62c requires that an investigator retain records required to be maintained under this part for a period of at least 2 years following the date of the marketing application approval for the drug and for the indication for which it is being investigated, or if no application is to be filed, or if the application is not approved for such indication until 2 years after the investigation is discontinued and the FDA is notified. This case example is about a protocol violation. The subject tested positive for pregnancy at screening, rescreening, and day 1, but she was allowed to enroll and receive study drug. This subject did not know about her pregnancy at the time of screening. Per protocol, a serum beta ECG of higher than 5.2 milli-international unit per ml at screening, rescreening, or any time during the study was determined to be ineligible for the study. The screening visit worksheets was completed, and it was noted that the subject was not pregnant or lactating and did not have a positive serum pregnancy test. Her screening serum HCG was around 80, indicative of pregnancy. This lab report was signed by the CI on the same day. At the next visit, again, about 2 weeks later, at rescreening visit, subject serum HCG was about 20,000. And again, the CI signed the lab report but did not pay attention to the high levels of HCG and completed the screening worksheet and noted that the subject was not pregnant. Once again, about 2 weeks later, on day 1 of the study, a third serum HCG was measured that was much higher than the second one. Again, CI signed the report and a statement that he had reviewed the eligibility criteria and determined that the subject was allowed to continue and to receive the study drug. So subject had already received 2 doses of one study drug and 3 doses of another study drug, and subject did not return to the clinic until reported that she had a miscarriage. The CI responded in the 483 response that serum HCG results were not flagged by the lab as being abnormal. Subject did not report any symptoms of pregnancy and stated that she was using contraceptive methods. For the corrective action and preventive actions, the CI had a series of communications with the lab to ensure that the abnormal levels were flagged and highlighted in a different column, and to convey all positive pregnancy tests to the key staff. CI also promised to check all the labs against the protocol for completeness, and that a second study staff would review the results to verify the eligibility of the subjects. The third case example was about a forecast inspection of a sponsor. We received a consult from one of our review divisions about the sponsor's non-compliance. Sponsor was conducting a study in which the enrolled subjects had hepatitis C infection co-infected with human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. The study was required to be conducted under an IND, but it was not. The sponsor used a study drug that was not a lawfully marketed drug in the United States, nor was it an unapproved version of an approved drug that is undergoing a bioavailability or bioequivalence study. So before using this drug in the clinical investigation, the sponsor was required to submit an IND to the FDA. Also, there was no proper monitoring. and the sponsor failed to identify and correct clinical investigators' noncompliance. As a result, we issued a warning letter because these were serious and significant violations. And the sponsor responded that in their judgment, it was not a drug, but it was used as a dietary and food supplement. And they conducted the study to obtain data to submit to the FDA in order to have sufficient safety and efficacy data to support an application. Here are the list of IND exemption criteria, and a study could be exempted from IND submission if it meets all of the IND exemption criteria. For the sake of time, I will just include the slides, but I'm not going to go over them. This slide and the next slide also include the whole list of IND exemption criteria. This final case example is about NITPO due to falsification of the records. A subject passed away during the conduct of clinical trial in November 2016. The CI signed and dated study records that falsely indicated that the study procedures that were required by the protocol, such as primary major adverse cardiovascular events or MACE, efficacy endpoint assessments, physical exams, adverse event assessments, and concomitant medication assessments were completed for 2 protocol-required study visits that occurred after the date of subject's death. These falsified records were submitted to the sponsor to support the data, including primary efficacy data collected at the site. Site completed 3 protocol-required telephone call assessments, including primary MACE efficacy endpoint, and other documentation such as adverse event, concomitant medications, and investigational product assessments after the date of subject's death. Disqualification means that CI is ineligible to receive test articles based on the requirements of 21 CFR 31270, and as a result, the clinical investigator is ineligible to conduct any clinical investigation that supports an application for a research or marketing permit for products regulated by the FDA. These include drugs, biologics, devices, new animal drugs, foods, including dietary supplements that bear a nutrient content claim or a health claim, infant formulas, food and color additives, and tobacco products. A disqualified clinical investigator cannot conduct clinical studies but could still take responsibilities such as being a sub-investigator in the clinical studies. Next, I will go over and provide some suggestions about corrective and preventive actions that may help improve sites' compliance. Here are some tips for corrective and preventive actions. Other than focusing on violations that were in the original OAI letter, establishing all GCP aspects and hiring qualified staff who are skilled and experienced to do the delegated tasks, improving documentations, including standard operating procedures that are complete and adequate, and work instructions, study worksheets, and training your staff for those delegated tasks, strengthening the infrastructure, which is fundamental to the conduct of clinical research, and specifically focusing on tailoring a corrective action, preventive action plan that is specific to the design of the study, and at the end, ensuring that the implementation of your corrective and preventive action plan is sustained and not repeated, so the issues are not repeated in the future. In summary, today, in this part of the webinar, I talked about different steps of CDER GCP inspection of a sponsor, clinical investigator, or sponsor investigator. I explained how we classify the inspections, went over some metrics, and I also showed you case examples with inspectional findings that can be included in an OAI letter. From all the previous slides, I would like to conclude my talk with 3 key points. In order to build high standards for GCP compliance, focusing on building quality into clinical trial process through proactive compliance. One of the key factors and one of the most important tools for ensuring human subject protection and high quality data is a well-designed and articulated protocol. And lastly, prospectively identifying the important risks to subject safety and data integrity or data reliability, and tailoring the protocol and its delivery to eliminate or mitigate these important risks. And here is the challenge question for you. I will give you a few seconds to reflect and respond. What is usually the most common type of regulatory violations found in clinical investigator inspections? Record-keeping violations? Is it informed consent violations, protocol violations, or failure to report unanticipated events to the IRB? It's C, protocol violations. And as you remember, I showed you a couple of graphs on this, that the clinical investigator inspections showed either in the domestic or foreign sites, both had protocol violations as the most common type of violations identified. These are some resources that can add to your information about GCP, BIMO program, and regulatory procedures discussed during my talk. Thank you for your attention. Now I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Rachelle Swann, who will give a presentation on OAI follow-up processes and will discuss the highlights of our recently published article related to this topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Faranak, for that excellent presentation, which was very informative, and I'm sure the audience appreciates the discussion on how CDER classifies GCP inspections and possible inspectional findings in an OAI letter, which I think ties in very nicely into our next discussion, which is what happens after you get an OAI letter. So as Faranak mentioned, my name is Rachelle Swann. I'm an acting team lead in the Compliance Enforcement Branch, and the focus of my presentation will be post-OAI status of inspected entities after issuance of an FDA OAI letter that cited GCP violations. So let me just start off by saying, yes, there is life after an OAI. Although previous research or publications may suggest that there is a high turnover rate for CIs conducting clinical research after issuance of an OAI letter, there really is limited research to examine whether the inspected entities continued conducting CDER-regulated clinical trials after they receive an FDA OAI letter. So I'm hoping that this discussion can help shed some light on this topic. So here is my disclaimer, which I have nothing to disclose. So as mentioned, there really haven't been a lot of research or analysis to assess what happens to inspected entities following the issuance of an OAI letter. So a few of us in the center tackled this particular question of what happens to inspected entities after receiving an OAI letter for GCP violations. As you can see on the left, we presented at the 2019 DIA annual meeting and we presented our findings. And on the right, we had our findings or results published in a 2021 DIA publication, which the link is provided here. And I hope that you'll take the time to review or read up on this publication. We will discuss the findings from this cross-sectional study later in our talk, but before we go into the publication, I wanted to give some background information on CDER's OAI follow-up process after inspected entities receive an OAI letter. So I'm going to cover a couple of different topics, all related to OAI follow-ups. But first, I'll go into the purpose, process, and procedures of OAI follow-ups for, background information. And then during the next 2 slides, I'll go into OAI follow-up objectives, then the process behind our OAI follow-ups. So as Faranak nicely described, when an inspected entity receives an OAI final classification, this indicates regulatory violations were identified that significantly impact subjects' rights, safety, and welfare, and/or significantly compromises data reliability. Because of the significant violations noted in the OAI letter, the agency continues to monitor inspected entities who received an OAI classification through either follow-up inspections or investigations. For inspected entities who continued to conduct CDER-regulated clinical trials, FDA conducts follow-up inspections to verify whether appropriate corrective actions have been adequately implemented and to ensure that the violations noted in the OAI letter were not repeated in any studies initiated or ongoing after the letter date. And if follow-up inspections reveal repeated and/or new significant regulatory violations, FDA may take further action depending on the significance, severity, and pattern of the observed violations. We'll go into the process a bit more in detail in the next slide. Shown here is a schematic of our OAI follow-up process. So as mentioned, we continue to monitor inspected entities even after issuance of an OAI letter. During this monitoring process, the center verifies whether the inspected entity has had any clinical research activity since issuance of the OAI letter. The decision on whether to conduct an inspection or an investigation is really based on a thorough post-OAI review of internal and external resources. So this would include FDA databases, extensive online search, incoming reports, or even complaints that come in regarding the inspected entity. When search results indicate inspected entities continue to conduct CDER-regulated clinical trials, we send an assignment memo to BIMO to confirm whether the inspected entity has in fact been involved in clinical research since issuance of the OAI letter. If BIMO confirms study activity, then they will conduct an OAI follow-up inspection in accordance with relevant compliance programs of any initiated or ongoing CDER-regulated clinical trials after an OAI letter was issued. The purpose is to verify whether appropriate corrective actions have been adequately implemented and to ensure that the violations noted in the OAI letter were not repeated in any studies initiated or ongoing after the OAI letter. When search results indicate inspected entities did not continue conducting CDER-regulated clinical trials, then BIMO performs an investigation, also known as an OP13, information gathering activity. During these investigations, BIMO will collect any relevant information to confirm the inspected entity's post-OAI status and confirm that they have not conducted or continue to conduct clinical research since issuance of the OAI letter. Depending on the outcome of BIMO's inspection or investigation, the field investigator will provide the center with the EIR, a Form 483 or OP13 memo, which contains any relevant information specific to BIMO's findings. When a 483 or EIR is sent to the center for review, BIMO will also provide their recommended classification of the inspection, along with the 483 EIR supporting evidence. I should mention that the Form FDA 483 does not constitute a final agency determination. That final determination will be made by the center, which is the same for our OAI follow-up inspections. Here in the center, We consider the 483, EIR, all evidence, and we also consider any submitted written response prior to making the final determination. Once a final classification is made, CDER will communicate the final outcome of the OAI follow-up inspection to the inspected entity. Now that we've laid the foundation for OAI follow-up and their objectives and process, let's now go into the OAI follow-up research project that we discussed earlier in the publication. The purpose for conducting this cross-sectional study was to understand and analyze the status of inspected entities, including clinical investigators, sponsors, sponsor investigators, and contract research organizations, CROs, after they receive an OAI letter following an inspection of a CDER-regulated clinical trial. So now we'll go into the study design and methods of our research publication. So I'll talk about how we designed the study, what data and resources were used, how we categorized our data, and finally how we analyzed the results for our study data. So data collection. In this cross-sectional study, we extracted our data from FDA internal databases. The collected data included CDER's records on our GCP inspections, which includes our Form FDA 483s, EIRs, any supporting evidence, any written responses to the 483, and of course, our issued OAI letters. We use a descriptive analysis to determine the status of the inspected entities that received OAI letters from October 1st, 2010 to September 30th, 2015. So for data categorization, overall inspection data was categorized by inspected entity type on right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner here, as shown here, which includes your clinical investigators, your sponsors, your sponsor investigators, and your CROs. We then looked at the type of letter or type of final letter classification, which would include your NAIs, VAIs, and OAIs. We then further subcategorize these OAI letters by domestic, so location, so were they domestic or foreign, so we looked at geographic location. We then looked at the reason behind the inspection. Did the inspection occur because of a pre-approval data audit to support a marketing application, or did a for-cause complaint or report trigger the inspection, or was it both? We then have our post-OAI analysis, so our OAI follow-up analysis, which includes two major buckets, as shown here. So we have our inspected entities who were found to be not conducting CDER-regulated clinical trials. So ultimately, an investigation occurred for those inspected entities. And then we have our inspected entities where we were able to confirm that they were continuing to conduct CDER-regulated clinical trials, and we were ultimately able to conduct an OAI follow-up inspection. Now I'll discuss these two buckets in the next slide in a little bit more details. So here in this diagram is a representation of the entire roadmap of our study. Again, we evaluated all inspected entities who had received an OAI letter between fiscal year 2011 and fiscal year 2015. As mentioned earlier, we have two major buckets that we analyzed, which included those inspected entities who were conducting CDER-regulated clinical trials after receiving an OAI letter, and ultimately we were able to conduct an OAI follow-up inspection, versus those who did not conduct CDER-regulated clinical trials after issuance of the OAI letter, and ultimately an OP13 investigation was completed for those inspected entities. Among those who had an OAI follow-up inspection, so going back to the right-hand side of our figure, if there were regulatory violations observed during the OAI follow-up inspection, those regulatory violations were grouped by the type of violation cited. So for example, protocol violations or record-keeping violations. So we did look at the types of violations that occurred, and then we compared those types of violations with those cited in the original OAI letter. We also determined whether these regulatory violations were repeat violations, new violations, or both repeat and new violations. So when I say repeat violations, this would be a recurrence of a previously cited regulatory violation on the original OAI letter. For new violations, this would be a regulatory violation not previously cited in the original OAI letter. And then, of course, you have a little bit of both repeat and new violations. Looking at the left side of your figure, so going back to those inspected entities that did not continue to conduct CDER-regulated clinical trials after issuance of the OAI letter, if information was available to us, these entities were categorized as either retired or resigned, disqualified, deceased, and they assumed a non-IE role or non-inspected entity role, or no future clinical research plans were specified since issuance of the original OAI letter. So we'll go more into these as we go through our presentation. So now that we talked about the purpose of the study and the methods that were used to conduct the study, let's now go into our study findings with lots of metrics and observed trends to discuss. So before jumping into our OAI data, let's just take a second to look at all the GCP post-inspectional letters issued to all inspected entities during the mentioned time frame that was analyzed. This bar graph shows that we had a total of 2,248 GCP-related letters issued between fiscal year 2011 and 2015, which we've broken these letters up by letter type and inspected entity. So you can see from this figure that NAI letters constitute the majority of post-inspectional correspondences for all inspected entities. I won't go through all the numbers since it's listed here in the slide, but you can see that CIs led the pack for the highest number of letters issued, with a total of 1,942 GCP-related letters issued, which included 95 OAI letters. Sponsors were the second entity type after CIs, with the highest number of letters issued, with a total of 215 GCP-related letters, including 7 OAI letters. CROs had 75 GCP-related letters issued, but you can see from this figure that no CROs had any OAI letters issued between fiscal year 2011 and fiscal year 2015. Sponsor investigators had a total of 16 letters issued to them, including 2 OAI letters. So between fiscal year 2011 and 2015, we had a total of 104 GCP-related OAI letters issued to all inspected entities. These letters were further analyzed to determine the inspected entity's status following the issuance of their OAI letter. So as mentioned, we had a total of 104 OAI letters issued between fiscal year 2011 and 2015, which make up a small percentage of GCP letters issued by the Center, as shown here in this pie chart. When looking at the figure on the right, we did look a little bit closer at those 104 OAI letters, and the majority of those OAI letters were issued to CIs, clinical investigators. You can see that a total of 95 OAI letters were issued to CIs, which included 47 untitled letters, 38 warning letters, and 10 NIPO letters, which 8 of those NIPOs resulted in disqualification. Sponsors received 7 OAI letters, whereas sponsor investigators received 2 OAI letters. As mentioned earlier, none of the CROs within the time frame that we looked at received any OAI letters. Therefore, CROs were not included as part of our CDER post-inspectional OAI letter analysis. Now that we've discussed the number of total GCP letters issued and how many resulted in an OAI final classification between fiscal year 2011 and 2015, let's now look more into the status of those inspected entities after they received their OAI letters. So just to recap on what was mentioned earlier, the post-OAI status of inspected entities were classified into two main categories. So going back to those two main buckets that I mentioned earlier. So either, inspected entities were found to not be conducting CDER regulated clinical trials, or we had inspected entities who we were able to confirm that they were conducting CDER regulated clinical trials. So as shown in the bar figure, of all the inspected entities included in our OAI follow-up analysis, most of the CIs, 70%, did not continue to conduct CDER regulated clinical trials after issuance of their OAI letter. Whereas for sponsors and sponsor investigators, there was an even split between those that were not conducting, CDER regulated clinical trials versus those who were conducting CDER regulated clinical trials. So, as mentioned, you can see that most CIs did not continue to conduct CDER regulated clinical trials after they received an OAI letter. Based on their original OAI letter type, 26 of these CIs received an entitled letter, 27 received a warning letter, and 10 received a NIPO, which ultimately 8 of those CIs who received a NIPO were disqualified. Among the 27 CIs who continued to conduct CDER regulated clinical trials, 18 had received an entitled letter as their original OAI letter, and 9 had received a warning letter. The percentage of CIs who did not continue CDER regulated clinical trials after receiving a warning letter was 75%, which was higher than the percentage of those who did not continue to conduct CDER regulated clinical trials after receiving an entitled letter, as shown here. Therefore, it may appear that CIs who received a warning letter had a higher percentage of stopping CDER regulated clinical research compared to those who received an entitled letter. However, this difference was not found to be statistically significant. Okay, so now that we've talked about how many CIs stopped conducting clinical research after their OAI letter, let's go into what exactly happened to those CIs. So if you remember in the previous method slide, we broke down the status of inspected entities not conducting CDER regulated clinical trials into 5 main subcategories listed here in this table on your left-hand side. I won't go through the numbers since they are listed in this table, but you can see that for the 63 CIs who were not conducting clinical research following issuance of their OAI letter, 35 CIs who were found not conducting clinical research did not provide information about their future plans for conducting clinical research, and 17 CIs were found to be retired after issuance of their OAI letter. Let's now look into inspected entities that conducted or continue to conduct CDER regulated clinical trials a little bit closer. On the left-hand side in this bar graph, we have the types of letters issued to the different inspected entities as an outcome of an OAI follow-up inspection. So for CIs, 16 OAI follow-up inspections resulted in a NAI letter, and 11 resulted in a VAI letter. Of the 2 OAI follow-up inspections for sponsors, both resulted in an NAI final letter. The single SI, sponsor investigator OAI follow-up inspection, resulted in a VAI letter. No OAI follow-up inspections resulted in an OAI letter. Looking at the pie chart on the right, we looked closer at the CIs who received a VAI letter, and a majority, 64% of them, had repeated violations. Not shown here, but we found that the majority of those repeated violations were protocol violations. However, in general, protocol violations are the most common observations during GCP inspections, so this shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Now, although some of these VAI cases had repeated violations, so recurrence of a previously cited regulatory violation, these repeated violations were not always of the same exact type of violation. And furthermore, the violations observed in these OAI follow-up inspections did not meet the threshold in subject safety and or data integrity to be classified as an OAI, and therefore they were classified as VAI. Okay, so those were some of the key findings from our study, which gives you some insight on what happened to some inspected entities that received an OAI letter between fiscal year 2011 and 2015. Now let's show a few case examples to help bring some perspective to our findings, specifically for cases where inspected entities were conducting CDER-regulated clinical trials following issuance of their OAI letter, and whether they were compliant with our GCP regulations. So let's jump into these case examples. Our first case example involves a 2015 CI-OAI warning letter issued for protocol violations, which would be under our Regulation 21 CFR 31260, and they were also cited for record-keeping violations, which would be under 31262B. After issuance of the 483 and OAI letter, the CI submitted a proposed CAPA plan to address the protocol and record-keeping violations. So the CAPA included, SOP development, training of site staff, and implementation of an eligibility checklist. So we issued OSI issued an assignment memo to BIMO. In 2016, they conducted the OAI follow-up inspection because they were able to confirm that the investigator was in fact conducting CDER-regulated clinical trials after issuance of the OAI letter. So during the follow-up inspection, there were no observed regulatory violations, and therefore this particular OAI follow-up inspection was classified as NAI as a final classification. Our second case is a 2015 CI-OAI entitled letter where we cited protocol violations again. As part of the CI's CAPA, they indicated protocol and GCP training will be implemented to prevent future repeat violations. So OBIMO was able to conduct an OAI follow-up inspection in 2016 since they were able to confirm that the CI was involved in clinical research. During the inspection, OBIMO did observe repeat violations, which included protocol violations for study-specific assessments not being completed and discrepant case report forms. So for this particular case, or this particular OAI follow-up inspection, a VAI letter was issued. So the VAI was the final classification, which the CI did provide a CAPA based on these new inspectional findings. Our third case example involves a sponsor OAI warning letter, which was issued in 2014 for the following cited violations as shown here. The sponsor basically failed to submit an IND prior to initiating clinical research in human subjects, and they also failed to ensure proper monitoring. So in 2017, OBIMO went out, conducted a OAI follow-up inspection because they were able to confirm that the sponsored study was still ongoing and active. So they were able to inspect the studies, and they were able to confirm that there were no observed regulatory violations. The final outcome of this inspection was NAI. So our final case example is a CI OAI entitled letter, which was issued in 2014 for record-keeping violations. The CI provided their proposed CAPA, which included GCP training, revised SOPs, and utilization of a quality control management team. We were able to inspect a year later to confirm whether corrective actions were implemented, which the follow-up inspection did confirm that SOPs and GCP training were implemented as a result of the 2014 inspection, which resulted in the OAI entitled letter. So During the OAI follow-up inspection, however, there were new violations that were observed for failure to assure continuing IRB review and approval. So a VAI letter was issued to the inspected entity, the CI, and the CI did provide a CAPA to address these new violations related to IRB approval, which include revised SOPs and training on IRB reporting requirements to prevent repeat violations. Okay, time for a challenge question. So based on what we've discussed, the question is, most CIs who were not conducting CDER-regulated clinical trials following issuance of an OAI letter were disqualified CIs. So please enter A if you think the answer is true, or select B if you think the answer is false. And I'll give you some time to answer the question. Okay, I hope that was enough time. So that was a tricky question, and the answer would be false. As you saw previously, there were multiple reasons why a CI may have stopped clinical research activity following issuance of an OAI letter. And disqualified CIs made up a very small percentage of those CIs who were found to have stopped conducting CDER-regulated clinical trial research following issuance of their OAI letter. So the answer is false. So to summarize, first we found the majority of CIs, so 70%, who received OAI letters did not continue to conduct CRCTs. Second, our findings showed that 59% of CI OAI follow-up inspections resulted in an NAI letter, while 41% resulted in a VAI letter. Our findings also showed that 64% of CIs, VAIs, after issuance or during the conduct of an OAI follow-up inspection noted a repeated but not significant violations in the VAI letter. And most repeated violations were related to procedural noncompliance. Finally, our study findings show that no OAI follow-up inspections resulted in an OAI classification, which is always a great thing to hear. So to end our talk, here are some key takeaway points which include FDA's efforts to promote and protect public health by ensuring safe and effective drugs reach the public, that we continue to monitor and take enforcement action for non-compliant inspected entities, and we continue to share inspectional data and trends. We want to continue to emphasize the importance of conducting high-quality clinical trials and adherence to our GCP regulations for the protection of subjects' rights, safety, and welfare, and ensuring data reliability. So that concludes my presentation. I want to thank everyone for your time and this chance to present our findings from our research publication on OAI follow-up analysis of inspected entities and their status after receiving an OAI letter for GCP violations. I also want to thank the audience and SBIA for allowing Dr. Kelly Nolen, Dr. Faranak Jamali, and myself this great opportunity to provide a general overview of FDA's BIMO program and discuss our GCP inspectional procedures, compliance evaluation, and some interesting case examples. So Kelly, Faranak, and myself, we plan on sticking around for the panel discussion, and I hope you will too. And we hope to answer any questions during the Q&A session. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone. I hope all of you can hear me. I want to thank each of our outstanding presenters and extend a very hearty welcome to all of our attendees. My name is Michelle Anantha, and I have the privilege of being your moderator for this panel session, as well as the upcoming live Q&A that will occur after the panel session. Like Drs. Jamali and Nolen, I am also a GCP Compliance Reviewer in the Office of Scientific Investigations, Compliance Enforcement Branch. As you may have gleaned from the presentations, in our roles, we evaluate inspectional findings indicating potentially significant GCP noncompliance related to the conduct of clinical investigations and the protection of human subjects. and we pursue the necessary regulatory action based on those findings. Just to give you a bit more background about me, before joining OSI, I was a reviewer in CDER's Office of Prescription Drug Promotion. And prior to coming to FDA, I worked in pharmaceutical sales and as a clinically practicing physician assistant. So we're going to start our approximately 30-minute live panel discussion with 3 FDA panelists that are on the slide here, followed by our live Q&A with both our 3 speakers as well as our 3 panelists. While the panel discussion is occurring, I encourage you to keep submitting your questions in the Q&A pod and to address them to the person that you would like the question to be answered by. Next, I'm going to introduce the panelists who have been invited not only for their experience and leadership in this area, but also for their support of our compliance enforcement branch's work. Our first panelist is Dr. David Burrow, who serves as the Director of the Office of Scientific Investigations within CDER's Office of Compliance. In this role, he helps lead CDER's BIMO program, including the development and implementation of policies, surveillance activities, and compliance strategies for CDER-regulated products. Dr. Burrow holds a Doctor of Pharmacy from Duquesne University and a Juris Doctorate from Weiner University School of Law. Our next panelist is Dr. Chrissy Cochran, who is the Director of the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations at the FDA, and she's responsible for working with each of FDA's product centers to manage the BIMO program. Her staff conduct inspections of clinical and non-clinical facilities to ensure that trial participants are protected and that the data used to support FDA decisions is reliable. Dr. Cochran holds a PhD in toxicology and a Bachelor of Science in biochemistry. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Karen Bleich, who has worked in the Office of Scientific Investigations for the past 3 years in the office's GCP assessment branch. This staff evaluate clinical trial conduct and clinical trial data integrity. Prior to joining OSI, Dr. Bleich was a clinical reviewer in CDER's Office of New Drugs for 3 years. And prior to coming to the FDA, she was a radiologist at Johns Hopkins for 10 years, involved primarily in oncology setting. All right, so let's get right into our panel discussion. So, we've heard that the focus of the 3 presentations was on serious GCP noncompliance, as well as OAI classifications and actions. So our panel is going to take these topics a step further and discuss, as time permits, 3 topics. The first being proactive GCP compliance, the second being the impact of serious GCP noncompliance on regulatory decision-making, and then the third on risk-based quality management. So let's get into the first topic about proactive GCP compliance. So, there are certainly instances out there of deliberate noncompliance, but, some or most of these cases of noncompliance don't stem from this deliberate noncompliance. FDA has always strongly encouraged regulated entities to invest in and promote and incentivize proactive GCP compliance. So for our panelists, what are 1 or 2 pieces of advice from your perspective that you could share with the audience about preventing serious GCP noncompliance and avoiding OAI letters in the first place? And I particularly want to talk about the different perspectives that each of you have. Like, for example, with Chrissy being, with the Office of Regulatory Affairs and then being the eyes and ears for CDER during our inspections and communicating with inspected entities in real time, what is the ability to address and correct noncompliance as it's being discovered? And then from Dave and Karen's perspective, being at headquarters or at the center, we're reviewing these inspectional findings and communicating with inspected entities after the inspection has occurred. So it's at 2 different points in the inspectional process. So let's kick it off with Chrissy.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Michelle, for that introduction, and happy to, start off this panel discussion today. One of the things that we find, when we're talking about the ability to address noncompliance as it's being discovered, as you mentioned, we really want to make sure that that is occurring at the sites. When the investigators come and they're doing an inspection, they're going to look to see if those issues that have been identified, so whether that was by the site identifying the issue itself, or maybe a monitor or the sponsor identified the issue, that those issues were corrected in real time. One thing that folks kind of forget about, and that is that, when we're correcting these issues, a lot of times folks, they will create an SOP or a form or provide training to their staff. But I just want folks to remember that that doesn't solve every problem. So really ensuring that you go back and make sure that whatever you did to address the problem actually fixed and corrected the problem is something that we frequently see as an issue that then can be carried forward. So yes, training is important. Yes, procedures are important to be standardized. But, we don't want you to forget to test that correction as well. And that is something that our investigators will be looking for when they're out on an inspection. And that can really go a long way to showing that you had the ability to identify this, to correct it, and to really do things in a correct manner. With that, I'll turn it over to Dave and Karen for some of their perspectives.
Thank you, Chrissy. Before Dave and Karen jump in, I just want to reiterate a point that you made about it's not only sufficient to take training and to develop SOPs and guidelines, you need a system in place that's going to assess and monitor the effectiveness of those measures as well. So thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, Dave and Karen.
Thanks, Michelle. I can definitely jump in here. I agree with everything Chrissy said, absolutely 100%. The pivot I'd like to make here in my comments is really just pulling that focus away from trying to avoid OAI letters. For that matter, it's not even about avoiding errors at all. We know that perfection is unattainable. What we're talking about here is the absence of errors that matter. That significance question. And it's really the name of the game in the quality conversation generally. As far as two pieces of advice are really concerned, I think that would have to really be number one, quality. It's building that culture of quality, preventing serious noncompliance. We know that it's an iterative process, not something where you can really ever just put a bow on it and say we've done what we needed to do, and that as a result, everything that comes out of this trial is going to be guaranteed to result in high quality, reliable, and interpreted data. It's not the way it works, right? That building quality into your culture as an organization really requires that continued assessment, the prioritization, the refinement, that eye on the horizon of the risks that might come up, maybe even risks that aren't yet present. It's that constant focus on ensuring high quality trial conduct. It's not just a one and done act. And then maybe the second part there, just that the focus needs to be on the awareness of roles across the silos, transparency and information, not segmented research ecosystems, but really the need for all aspects to be fully integrated. It's the information from the early risk assessment and mitigation work that feeds into the protocol development and the quality by design, the critical to quality factors, which then of course feeds into how you develop and operationalize a real true risk-based monitoring strategy. It can't happen in silos. So the best piece of advice really is to ensure that all parts of that ecosystem understand the dependencies and have the information that they need to really be able to effectively do their part in support of the larger whole, the quality conversation at the trial and application level. And even just for that matter, to take that a step further, I remind everybody to really be aware of the communication and expectations when you're talking with contractors, when sponsors are talking with contractors. For example, like contracting out a specific part of your clinical trial operation without those contractors or vendors really having the full and complete information and line of sight on the precursor steps of risk-based quality management systems. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later on here, but you just can't copy and paste parts of your trial risk management and operations from one trial to another outright. And I think, to the extent that individual components might need to be uniquely tailored to the specific studies, those contractors and vendors would really need to be able to have the full access to the precursor steps and all the associated documentation, the quality by design analysis, the risk assessments, the mitigation strategies that all kind of feed into that trial design consideration and need to be incorporated into the downstream operations. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. I think your discussion of absence of errors that matter really drives home a point, and I think all the points you just made lay a fantastic groundwork for what we're going to discuss later about risk-based quality management. Finally, Karen, do you have anything?
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I would just like to dovetail onto what was already said in terms of when problems do occur during a trial, in terms of addressing them right away. Chrissy had mentioned the need to test your corrections, and Dave had mentioned that quality is an ongoing process. And I would add to that to really do your root cause analysis when you identify problems that have occurred in an ongoing trial, because we have seen cases where the same problem recurs and it's identified by a monitor, and then it occurs again, and then it's identified by a monitor, and then by the time we arrive, we see that this has been going on for much longer than it should have. In some cases, we've identified through inspection that the root cause of protocol violations was errors in the template documents that didn't represent what the protocol required. So these are the types of things that we really expect a quality trial site to identify and fix and not allow to continue. And then my second bit of advice, where I am, we're often addressing noncompliance after it's occurred. And I know that Faranak had talked about the importance of that 483 response, but I just want to add on to that, we really want to know what the clinical investigator thought of each 483 item, and to also provide supporting documents so that we understand and can see exactly what you're talking about. One of the common responses that we get is that the findings occurred or the non-compliance occurred because there was a study coordinator who didn't do a good job. And we get that that certainly happens, but what we want to know is how are you going to prevent that from happening again? Because of course it's the clinical investigator who is responsible for the conduct of the study at the site. So I just want to add that to the list of advice that we really need to hear, that you understand it's your responsibility and how you're going to prevent that specific problem in the future. That's all I have, Michelle.
Thank you, Karen. And yes, I agree with you that it's really important just to look at every single person's role, all the way down to, as you mentioned as an example, a template form, especially if mistakes keep occurring over and over again. All right, let's transition into our second topic. So, we just talked about how ideally everyone shares responsibility for preventing serious GCP noncompliance. But from FDA side, aside from issuing OAI letters, what can we do if data reliability is or has been compromised? So, we receive data from inspections that impact regulatory decision making in our pre-market application reviews, such as in NDAs and BLAs. So, how does OSI handle cases that are inspected in support of a marketing application and turn out to have significant adverse impact on data integrity and reliability? And for this one, I'll start with you, Karen.
Oh, thank you. So, this question really highlights the important point that we do two distinct analyses of inspection findings. And so one is the determination of the regulatory compliance, of the inspected entity, and that's what we've been discussing. And the other piece is a determination of the reliability of the study data, which we're using to evaluate a marketing application. And these two analyses don't necessarily align. We may have instances of significant concerns regarding trial data, even in a setting without significant regulatory noncompliance. And so a recent example of that was we had a clinical investigator inspection, and there were concerns about the reliability of a portion of the data because so all of the study subjects were receiving dialysis, and many of them received concomitant medications during dialysis that would impact the assessment of the endpoint, and these were not reported. And so what does OSI do when we have that type of a data concern? And I'll just mention that in the context of the protocol, there were not significant regulatory compliance issues in this case. So this was certainly not an OAI classification, but we had this concern about the data at the site because they were not incorporating dialysis medications into the concomitant medications lists for all of the subjects. And so there's a couple of things that we can do. One is we provide the corrected information, to our reviewers so that they know, okay, by the way, these 25 subjects at the site were receiving this particular medication, and you probably want to, take note of that. And then the second thing that we often do, if we have concerns about a portion of the study data, is we recommend a sensitivity analysis, which basically means we consider the results of the study excluding a portion of the data and then look to see how much of an impact that data had. In this particular case with the dialysis medications, it seemed to us plausible that this could have happened study-wide because it wasn't clear how to handle the dialysis medications. And so that's exactly what we did for all of the subjects who did not have the medicine in question reported. We recommended that they all be excluded because we couldn't be sure whether or not they had received this medication that was important to the endpoint. And in this case, it was found that the study results were robust, even without that portion of the data in that separate analysis. And so that medication ended up receiving approval. But I wanted to make that as a point. And in fact, we did a review recently of these types of situations in terms of how often do we have data concerns for which we have recommendations. And we found that that number was almost 20%. And so that's certainly much larger than you would expect if they were all coming from OAI inspections. And so while, of course, the focus of this event is the regulatory compliance, we're all interested in having reliable and valid data. So it's an important second piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I really like that example because it really illustrates to me and hopefully to the audience that, there is this distinction between regulatory compliance and clinically acceptable data reliability, and that they don't always jive, but they're both very important, whether we're talking about OAI classifications or VAI classifications. Dave and Chrissy, do you have anything to add to Karen's comments?
Michelle, Karen really hit it out of the park there, and it's exactly in her wheelhouse here. We often talk about this dual role that we hold. On one hand, focusing on the support of the review of the application, high quality data analysis and interpretability, and on the other hand, recognizing our role as a regulatory and enforcement agency and the responsibilities that we engage in protecting the public health. And this type of question, this conversation really gets to the crux of that dual role. We know that a single clinical investigator inspection, maybe OAI or VAI or NAI here, and we could highlight some of the protocol deviations, but a single clinical investigator site rarely has the huge impact on the assessment of a multinational global clinical trial as a whole. So really what matters for us here in this context is exactly what Karen is talking about, looking at issues across systems, across clinical sites, across studies as a whole, and how like the conduct of those studies is really going to help to inform our assessment of the data for the application as a whole. And those are really two very different types of activities. On one hand, the follow-up that we're going to engage in with a clinical site, with an individual site based on an inspection, and on the other hand, the messaging with the review division and the applicant about the review and the assessment of an application as a whole. And while I have you here, because I have you here, there's a third hat that we really wear here in CDER, and that's one directed towards increasing like this type of conversation, the volume of and the quality of messages that we have industry wide, and really kind of focusing the experiences and best practices with industry to really be able to use that to prevent something similar from happening in other applications or other studies or other sites. And that's really about this type of outreach and education experience and incredible events like this, where we have the opportunity to have these conversations with people like you across the entire ecosystem of clinical research globally. And for that, I thank you. Really appreciate it.
Very well said, Dave. Chrissy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just say that, I totally agree with everything that Karen and Dave had said. And, this is really a partnership, right? So, we work very closely within ORA. We work very closely with the folks in CDER, as well as the other product centers as well, to ensure that we're going out there and doing inspections for sites that hopefully is going to provide us the greatest amount of information into how that particular study was conducted. And so this is really, a coordinated effort between both groups to try to ensure that we're getting the best information that we can then provide back to the review divisions to say, here's the information you need to be able to make a decision on that particular product application. So, we work hand in hand. We can't have one without the other, kind of like peanut butter and jelly. And, everything that we do kind of, flows through and works through them as well. And so, really appreciate all that OSI does, in helping us with being able to do that and support the public health.
Thank you, Chrissy. Yes, it's definitely a team effort and a collaboratory effort, and it definitely takes a village to get this work done. So time flies when you're having fun. So let's go to the last topic. I'm going to go back 2 topics to our first topic when we were talking about proactive GCP compliance, and go back to talking about what Dave was discussing at the end of that topic about quality. And, we've talked about, quality by design and risk-based monitoring, but I want to go a step further and talk about RBQM, or risk-based quality management. And so for those who don't know what this is, that takes the principles of risk-based monitoring plus quality by design and applies them to the entirety of the clinical trial, meaning that, you're applying these to all elements of the trial, from the designing and planning stages all the way through execution and conduct analysis and reporting of your study results. So you're using things such as technology, software, analytics, statistics to detect data quality issues in real time, which is really fantastic. And that enables you to take corrective action, hopefully, before these issues, become a problem and significantly impact your trial's data integrity. So that being said, we're going to go back to a round robin style, and can you each provide from your perspective what you believe are the top 3 aspects that industry should consider in moving to RBQM? And I'm going to start with Dave.
Thanks, Michelle. I love this question. I love the top 3, top 5, top 10 kind of helpful hints and things like that. And what we're really talking about here is that renewed message that risk-based monitoring is just part of risk-based quality management systems. And FDA has a really critical interest in ensuring that you have a robust ecosystem across all different domains of clinical research. Risk-based quality management system is central to core operations. It's the beating heart of clinical research, and ensuring that we have effective risk-based quality management systems across all aspects of the design and conduct of the trials. I think for me, the top 3 aspects for industry to really consider, I have to focus on first building that foundation. consider and really dedicate yourself to building the solid foundation of a robust and resilient risk-based quality management system. And that means all of the associated elements that would need to be incorporated in that. Not just a name, not just saying that we're going to do X, Y, Z, but all of the associated systems and infrastructure, various personnel necessary to really effectively operationalize a true risk-based quality management system. I think that part about personnel often really gets the short end of the stick, because I mean, you can have tools and technology and systems, but those are only really as good as the professionals engaged in their effective operations. And we really need to ensure that we have a continued focus on workforce development across the board. And then maybe secondly, the considerations of the unique nature of the study design, the endpoints, the disease state, the subject population, and the network of clinical sites that you have at your disposal. It's not just like a one-size-fits-all approach. This conversation about risk-based quality management systems needs to be flexible and dynamic, and needs to be really uniquely tailored from the start. You can't necessarily just use an existing risk-based quality management system structure from trial A and apply it to trial B. There could be elements that can be adopted and incorporated, but that copy and paste mentality is not going to be effective as a risk-based quality management approach. Regardless of what you call it, the results are not going to be there. And then third, lastly, I think consider the global association or global associations. You know, FDA is not the only regulator in this space. And I think full consideration should also really be given to the messages from our foreign regulatory counterparts. Remember that like the core interest for all parties, it continues to be about quality data in support of applications, quality conduct, protecting the right safety and welfare of subjects. Focus on quality in all aspects of your activities, not so much on the terminology, the risk-based monitoring, RBQMS, QBD, CTQ, KPI, QTLs. You have the alphabet soup that really, it can drive you nuts. So just focus on what you need to do in order to drive quality for your specific study and build quality into your own specific type of research deliberately based on your own unique needs, the systems you have in place, the infrastructure, and the personnel. Focus on quality by design, robust systems to detect and correct errors in real time. I'm rambling. I'll stop. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Dave. That was felt like that was a masterclass in RBQM in about 2 or 3 minutes. That was fantastic. So Chrissy and Karen, would you like to add anything to Dave's comments?
Yeah, absolutely. If I could, I'd like to build a little bit on Dave's concept of, building a foundation. And as you're doing that and looking at what you need to do to really make sure that you have the best quality trial up front, make sure you're involving everyone who's involved in all parts of that trial up front. So, it's not just about talking to the doctors who are the experts in that particular field, but talk to some patients, get the data management folks involved, get the clinical monitors involved, regulatory staff, nurses, etc. Make sure everyone who's going to play a part in that particular protocol or that particular trial has a thoughtful, careful, and upfront discussion about, what are we trying to do? And, I think you'll find if you build in that quality up front and take a little bit of extra time, it'll save you time on the back end. You could potentially, save some money by, hopefully closing out your trial a little bit sooner. Maybe you won't have to monitor as much. There's a whole lot of things that, when you do that planning up front, you can save on the back end. And so, it really just kind of behooves you to get all those folks involved and really build that foundation about what is necessary to capture and what is it we're trying to do, versus kind of those nice to know items that might get you in trouble down the road. You never know. So, I think that is really one of the best things to think about is, kind of that solid foundation. and then thinking about, quality versus regulatory compliance. You can have both. Some folks don't necessarily think that way, but the regulations are really set up for you to be able to develop a quality system that works for you. And I would encourage folks to really take a look at the regulations and determine how that works and how that really fits into your particular style and your particular setting.
Thank you, Chrissy. I really appreciate those comments about upfront investment, because often we hear, oh, it takes so much time. Oh, it's so expensive. But, ultimately at the end of the day, you're probably going to wind up with a better, faster, and cheaper clinical trial. Karen, do you have any final thoughts on this topic?
I would just add, from the more concrete angle, since I'm more on the ground, to really consider what is your critical data, and that can be both safety and efficacy, and then think about how you're going to, assure somebody of the integrity of that data, and think about what training is needed for the people getting that data, what documentation is needed. These are the kinds of errors that we see. So I would encourage clinical investigators to really focus on their clinical data. And like Dave said, it's not necessarily about all those fancy words. It can be, it can be approached from a more simple framework.
Thank you, Karen, for that boots on the ground in the trenches perspective. All right, time is over for our panel discussion. We are now going to move into our live Q&A session. And let's see. Our first question is going to be for Chrissy. And let me just get my bearings for a second. All right, here's a good question, Christy. So some other health authorities, for example, the European agencies, have moved towards conducting more remote-based inspections over the past few years. So do you foresee FDA moving to conduct inspections remotely even after the COVID-19 pandemic has ended? Or do you think they will continue with on-site inspections?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That's a great question. And here's one thing that we need to think about, in this regard, is the differences in authority that the different regulatory agencies have. So within the United States, our authority to inspect says we actually need to do an on-site inspection. We need to be there in person. And that's not necessarily the case when you're talking about the European Union and the entities over there. So we will be doing on-site inspections. We have been doing on-site inspections for BIMO throughout the pandemic. And so that is something that we will continue to do. With the remote assessments, those are voluntary. So, we try to do those only when we don't have another option. There might be a COVID-related issue or a safety-related issue, because we do realize that those are also very time-consuming on the site that we're trying to inspect. What you might see in the future is that you might see a hybrid approach, where maybe we ask for some information and documents up front, and then hopefully we can spend a little bit shorter time on site with you. But we haven't really worked all the logistics out of that yet. It's something that we're still working on, and more to come on that in the future. But I do not think that remote assessments are completely going away. I think they will be something that we will use in conjunction with our on-site inspections.
Thank you, Chrissy. Next question is for Faranak. So Faranak, when is the response to a Form FDA 483 required, and when is it helpful prior to the EIR to eliminate 483 findings, for example? And is it advantageous to reply to a 483 for an inspection that has been recommended VAI classification?
Thank you, Michelle. This is a good question and is very commonly asked. So the inspected entities are not obligated to respond to the Form 483, but if they respond, we do acknowledge and review their response, and we'll consider the response if they provided within 15 business days after the close of the inspection. However, sometimes the inspected entities are responding after 15 working or business days. In that case, we will still review the response and we acknowledge the receipt of the response, but the response will not be discussed in the warning letter in accordance with the FDA Commissioner's Enforcement Initiative that was announced in on August 11, 2009, that we establish a time frame of no more than 15 working days for the submission of post-inspection responses. Likewise, although it will remain within the FDA's discretion to issue a warning letter at any time, independent of receiving a response, FDA intends usually to conduct a detailed review of the response if it was received within the 15 working day time frame before determining whether or not it was to issue a warning letter. Thank you for the question.
Sure, and one quick follow-up question. The question is, I thought you stated that it is not a regulatory requirement to respond to Form FDA 483. Can you please confirm that?
No, it is not a regulatory requirement, no.
Okay, thank you, Faranak. The next questions are for Kelly. Two-part question, Kelly. The questioner asks, I am not familiar with the term sponsor investigator. What is the difference between the sponsor investigator and clinical investigator?
Thanks, Michelle, for that question. So a sponsor investigator is an individual who initiates and also conducts the clinical investigation. The sponsor investigator is required to comply with regulatory requirements applicable to both sponsors and clinical investigators. Whereas the difference with the clinical investigator is this person is the individual who conducts the clinical investigation and is responsible for the overall conduct of the study at the clinical site. And you said there was a
Thank you.
two-part?
Yes, yes. So the second part is, I'm a new sponsor investigator in an academic institution. So what regulation?
Okay, so for a sponsor investigator, both the clinical investigator and sponsor regulatory requirements apply.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Next question is for Dave. So Dave, the question is, I've read a lot of responses to observe noncompliance, which include items such as to establish an SOP or to retrain staff. The vast majority of this type of comment are rejected as inadequate. So what exactly is the agency looking for as a corrective action for a finding of noncompliance?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, this is a great question that we get quite often about like what really is the expectation for the response in terms of demonstrating to us that the actions have been taken in such a way that is going to prevent the recurrence of either that specific type of violation or something similar. And just, the phrase that we like to use is that a mere promise is not enough. So that when we're talking about SOPs and training records, what we really are looking to see is that you've identified the real crux of the issue, what went wrong, and that you have a SOP or a procedure in place to be able to ensure that it doesn't go off the rails the same way that it did before, that you have a complete process in place where everybody knows their roles and responsibilities across the different players at your site or your facility, and when those responsibilities need to be carried out. So the first step is really to identify what that new process or SOP needs to be. But that just doesn't end there, that we need to make sure that we can get a copy of that document saying that you have created an SOP isn't going to increase our level of comfort or certainty that if properly implemented, it's going to prevent the recurrence. We'd like to see a copy of that on its own, like in addition. But we'd also like to see the records of training your staff on that SOP, on that procedure, the training materials, the training log, and have all of that documentation sent to us as well so that we can verify that not just you had an SOP that would prevent the recurrence of that violation, but that your staff, all of the staff, have been trained properly on it. And also a process or a procedure in place to be able to assess whether the SOP and the training were effective in preventing the recurrence. You have maybe a plan to assess its efficacy in 3 months, and that you would then document what you did to assess whether that SOP was effective, and a process in place to be able to take additional corrective actions or refine as necessary based on your findings from that assessment. And then lastly, of course, submit all of that information to FDA so that we would be able to see the SOP, the training records, the training log, the plan for your follow-up assessment, the findings of your assessment, and any additional corrective actions that you might have taken as a result of that. When you submit that type of documentation to FDA, you've left no doubt. You've left no doubt that the actions that you have taken are going to prevent the recurrence, because you've already demonstrated that you are continuing to follow up and maintain that assessment. Thanks, Michelle. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. Next question is for Karen. So Karen, how does FDA determine which pre-approval inspections to conduct? Does FDA inspect all NMEs, which are new molecular entities? What about a product with a line extension?
Thanks, Michelle. So, it's important to bear in mind that we consider BIMO inspections for all of the major or pivotal clinical trials that are submitted to us to support safety and efficacy claims. And that includes claims, for new drug applications, BLAs, and also supplements. And so there are a number of factors that may contribute to the decision whether or not to conduct BIMO inspections and which entities. But I think it's most important to note that we don't have a hard and fast rule that certain types are or are not going to be inspected. It's really on an application by application basis. Now, that said, there are factors that contribute to our decision-making thoughts, and those include what type of application, with an NME being the type of application where we don't have pre-existing safety data or efficacy data, that yes, that will contribute to our decision to conduct inspections. Also, applications that are a first marketing application for an applicant, a firm with whom we're not familiar with the types of trials that they have conducted and they don't have an inspection history with us. And then other factors include specific data concerns that might be raised. And this may be, results for either safety or efficacy that are unexpected. This could include site results that are highly variant between different locations of where the study was conducted. And then the next factor would be concerns about trial conduct. And this can be things that come to our attention through the clinical study report from the sponsor, or it could be information that has come to us in the form of complaints about entities involved in that particular trial. And then another factor we consider is studies that are conducted entirely outside of the US. If we're not familiar with the institutions or the firms, that can be an additional factor. And I think that pretty much covers the way that we think about it. But the main point is that it's really done on an application by application basis, and that we do consider this for all of the marketing applications.
Okay, thank you, Karen. So a quasi follow-up question to that is number of INDs being a potential factor in selecting clinical investigator sites for inspection. The attendee asked if you can provide more detail about that.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I think it was Faranak who went over our clinical investigator site selection tool, and it does have an algorithm that helps us to determine the risk for each of the clinical investigator sites that we're considering. And so the number of INDs is an input into that analysis, but it's not something upon which a decision is usually based on its own. So for example, having a very high or a very low IND number for a particular clinical investigator is not likely to be the deciding factor. More commonly, it may be that, for example, a clinical investigator may have a very high number of INDs and no prior inspections, and is also of interest in terms of efficacy or enrollment numbers or outliers in other parameters. And then if we're comparing a few different sites that we're considering, that person might end up more likely to be inspected simply because we're aware that a lot of research is being done there and we haven't reviewed that person previously.
That's very informative. Thank you, Karen. I always learn something new whenever I talk to my colleagues. Sorry, I just muted myself. The next question is for Rachelle. So Rachelle, is it possible to receive a 483, but the response is sufficient enough to then receive a final classification of VI?
Thanks, Michelle, for that question. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So I would say it really depends on the scope and severity of the violations that will determine the final classification. So keep in mind that VAI final classification indicates regulatory violations were observed during an inspection, but the violations are not significant and doesn't rise to the level of an OAI final classification. So it really depends on the severity of the violations. I also do want to add that, as mentioned, the 483 is not a final determination. So it is always beneficial to submit a complete and thorough written response because there might be a situation where an inspected entity might have new evidence to provide the centers for review. And if they can provide that within the required timeline, this might help the center in reviewing the case.
Thanks, Rachelle. So it sounds like, it's FDA's motto, it all depends on a case-by-case basis. Just a quick follow-up question I have for you, which actually harkens back to the discussion on the OAI follow-up outcome publication. So if we have an OAI follow-up inspection that resulted in repeat violations, why then would the FDA issue a VAI letter instead of?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I'm assuming that's being discussed or asked because of the publication finding that the majority of CIs who received a VAI following an OAI follow-up inspection, the violations were found to be repeated. However, as mentioned, these repeated violations were not considered significant violations, and again, does not meet the threshold of an OAI, and therefore a VAI final classification was given in that case.
Okay, sounds good, Rachelle. Thank you. Makes sense. Next question for Chrissy. So Chrissy, the BIMO manual / CPGM was updated back in September of 2021 and had a lot of content added, particularly in areas like data collection and handling. Historically, in this attendee's experience with FDA, it's been mostly hands-off when it came to direct or guided access to most of the clinical trial systems outside of SADA databases and electronic data capture. So the attendee goes on to ask that, many European Union agencies request direct and guided access to a number of clinical trials and systems, something that is now emphasized in the draft EMA guideline on computerized systems. So this person's curious if you think that FDA will move towards requesting direct or guided access to other study-specific GXP systems, as we see with other EU agencies.
Yeah, great question. So, historically, FDA has not, requested direct access to computer systems. And there's a number of reasons behind that. But what we have done and what we have seen that's been beneficial, before just prior to and during the pandemic, is having that direct access really can kind of speed some of the review up during the course of the inspection. So we have updated our investigations operations manual which is kind of the manual that explains how we do inspections, that is publicly available on FDA's website. And if you go in that manual, the IOM, to chapter 5.10, that deals with bioresearch monitoring. And in that section, there is actually a procedure in there for BIMO investigators, if they are going to a site that has electronic records, that we can access and request access to those electronic systems. So, previously what we would do is we would request that someone from the site sit with us and we would direct them where to go. We'd say, click on this over here, now click on that over there. Can you pull up this report for me, etc. What we are doing now with this particular procedure is our investigators do have to get approval in order to access those systems directly from their supervisor. So they'll talk to the site, make sure that it's, the site is comfortable with that, and then they'll talk to their supervisor. And we request that we only receive access that is read-only and only for the duration of the inspection. We will ask that, somebody walk through with us and explain the system. How does it work? What can we find where? And then be available during the course of the rest of the inspection if there are questions. And that then will free up site staff a little bit more to go do some other things as well. So that is something that we are doing. We started that just prior to the pandemic. And that is something that we will be continuing in BIMO for, the foreseeable future.
All right, thanks for the update, Chrissy. Next question is for Faranak. Faranak, who do we follow up with if we had an inspection but have not received a follow-up letter from the agency?
Oh, thank you, Michelle, for the question and from the audience. So in that case, you can contact the either the ORA investigator who conducted the inspection or the contact information that was provided to you for sending any post-inspectional correspondence. I think that's all I can say. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Faranak. Kelly, you're up next. Can you explain the relevance of ICH GCP to FDA inspection? And another question that kind of goes with that, how does E6 inform or influence the BIMO inspection program? And does FDA participate in authoring ICH guidelines?
Thanks for that question, Michelle. So for the first part, in general, FDA inspections follow FDA regulatory requirements. However, for international studies, including in the European Union, Japan, as well as the United States, FDA requires clinical sites to follow FDA regulations if studies are conducted under an IND. If a foreign clinical site does not conduct clinical studies under an IND, the FDA expects the site to follow the ICH E6 GCP recommendations. As this is a guidance, I do want to reiterate that the guidance recommendations are just that and not enforceable. As far as authoring, the FDA does author ICH guidances with consideration of good clinical practices that are currently in place for the EU, Japan, and the US. Thanks, Michelle.
All right, thanks, Kelly. All right, Dave, you're up next. So this is a great question and gets to the heart of what we were talking about in the first and third topics of our discussion panel. So the question is, how does FDA perceive the role of quality in GCP? So this person has often received pushback throughout the years that, quote, quality is not required, end quote, and therefore proactive quality activities or participation in processes are not necessary. What is the FDA's thinking on this line of thought? Is it appropriate to leverage the concept of GMP quality to GCP?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I think I know why you asked me this question, and the answer there really is that I think I disagree wholeheartedly with the statement that quality is not required. Really disagree with that with every fiber of my being. In fact, our entire regulatory oversight structure is driven towards supporting quality, quality in the design, quality in the conduct, quality in the reporting of clinical research. It's all focused on ensuring the agency has reliable and interpretable data necessary to evaluate the safety and efficacy in a marketing application. So poor quality, unreliable data is not and cannot be used to support marketing applications. So like in that context, quality is absolutely required, and violations of our regulations are definitely going to result in OAI enforcement actions. It's the entire fundamental structure of GCP is or are dedicated to quality. It's been more than 10 years now that I think we've been talking about the protocol as the blueprint for quality. So violations of the protocol are definitely impinging on quality and going to be violations for us. And the effective use of risk-based monitoring, risk-based quality management systems, and the process to build quality and assess quality is a fundamental or foundational, that's not even a word, fundamental, there you go, how about that? A fundamental principle of building quality into clinical research. Even I think quality by design has been a key focus of our messaging over the last decade or so, because quality is not an accident, right? It's not magic. It comes through the focused and deliberate efforts through the course of the design, the conduct, and the analysis of a trial. And it's not a one and done activity. You don't just do a single thing one time and then have high quality, properly conducted trial with reliable and interpretable data. It just doesn't work that way. It's an iterative process that takes that focused attention and is going to be specific to the individual interests and needs of that trial, the subject population, and the study design. I think there was a reference in that question there about GMP quality too, and I really can't comment too much on that, but I will note that there are significant differences, just fundamental differences between the way a manufacturing line might operate versus the way a clinical trial would operate. So the conversation about quality management there, I think, shifts a little bit as well. We're talking about quality in clinical research across all clinical sites. It's involving every touch point with a person, both with the subjects involved as participants in research across all the sites, and the touch points with all the associated study staff, the CRCs, the CRAs, the monitors, all the study personnel and the site personnel, every person. I think GCP quality has that inherent human context to it. And I think I mentioned that earlier, that we need to consider the workforce of clinical research and ensuring that we have the right people in the right positions with the right skill sets and the resources to be able to effectively do their job. In terms of other resources, I would highly recommend looking into the city projects, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, all of the free information that they have there, the toolkits to be able to really effectively operationalize a lot of the quality management systems, the quality by design principles that we've talked about here today. They have those all available on their website for free. And just to be clear, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is a partnership with FDA, so it's not like my reference there is really endorsing any company or vendor. I would never do such a thing, of course. And then if you haven't already done so, or you haven't already committed them to memory, please remember to take a look at the ICH E8 and ICH E6R2. Those documents are really incredible resources, and I think a deeper conversation on strategies to effectively operationalize and implement the concepts of E8 and E6R2 would really be like a week-long course on its own. So I'm not going to get into that today. But I will note, though, that you probably should keep an eye out for ICH E6R3, but that's still in the early phases right now, so not too much to be able to share on that. But it is going to be a key indicator of the direction the wind is blowing in the future. And I know I've mentioned documentation several times during the course of my comments here this afternoon, and there's a great quote. It says that a goal that's not written down is just a fantasy. And the planning, the documentation, all the things that we're talking about here, they're all focused on that conversation about risk-based quality management systems. And those are the actions that can really take this goal and bring about the reality, take it from being a fantasy and bring it back to being a reality, just writing down those plans and effectively implementing them across the clinical trial ecosystem. And Michelle, for that, I will say thank you.
Wow, thanks, Dave. I think that is an extremely appropriate way to wrap up our live Q&A session. And I will take your comments and encourage all of the FDA-regulated entities that are on the call, take that as your call to action to think about proactive, quality-driven, and incentivized GCP compliance. So I want to thank our attendees, our presenters, our panelists, and this acknowledgement slide is for those who have furiously worked behind the scenes, both before and during this webinar. We want to first thank CDER SBI staff and contractors for your organizational, technical, and logistical assistance. To Dr. Mia Zhang, who is our supervisor in the Compliance Enforcement Branch, for her expert assistance with the Q&A, as well as assistance with the planning process, and most importantly, providing moral support. Mr. Amir Tahami for assistance with data and metrics, and Dr. Sherry Booz and Ms. Kristen Maloney for their review of the slide presentations. So we all wish everyone's continued health and safety. And with that, Ray, I'll turn it back to you for a final